The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo through my entire life. Judge Patricia Henley's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. Mr. Richardson, based on the evidence presented, I'm awarding primary custody to the petitioners. You'll have supervised visitation rights every other weekend, pending further review. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I felt the world tilt sideways. 22 years I'd spent serving this country. 2 tours in Afghanistan, countless nights away from home, protecting the freedoms we all took for granted. And now, sitting in a sterile courtroom in downtown Phoenix, I was being told I wasn't fit to raise my own children. My ex-wife Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, a shark in an expensive suit named Marcus Webb. But it wasn't just Sarah anymore. No, she'd brought reinforcements. Her parents, Donald and Margaret Ashford, had flown in from Connecticut with their own legal team. Old money, old connections, and the kind of influence that could make problems disappear or create them where none existed before. The Ashfords had never liked me. From the moment Sarah brought me home during our college years, they'd made it clear that a kid from rural Montana with calloused hands and military dreams wasn't their vision for their daughter's future. They'd tolerated our marriage for the sake of their grandchildren, but the moment our divorce papers were filed, they'd swooped in like vultures. Your Honor, Marcus Webb had argued earlier that morning, his voice dripping with practiced sincerity. My clients have serious concerns about Mr. Richardson's ability to provide a stable environment for Emma and Michael. His military service, while admirable, has left him with documented PTSD. The children have reported feeling unsafe during his episodes. Episodes. That's what they called the nightmares that sometimes woke me in a cold sweat, the moments when a car backfiring would send me diving for cover behind a grocery store display. Never mind that I'd been in therapy for 3 years, that I'd never once raised my voice to my children, let alone my hand. Never mind that Emma, 13, and Michael, 10, had always run to me first when they scraped a knee or needed help with homework. The Ashfords wanted everything. Full custody wasn't enough. They were pushing for my parental rights to be terminated entirely. They'd hired private investigators who'd dug up every classified mission I'd been on, every friend I'd lost, every moment of darkness I'd faced in the service of my country. They'd twisted it all into a narrative that painted me as a dangerous, unstable veteran who posed a threat to his own children. Sarah wouldn't even look at me. The woman I'd married 17 years ago, the one who used to trace the scars on my shoulders and tell me how proud she was of my service, now sat rigid in her chair as her attorney painted me as a monster. Her parents flanked her like sentries, Margaret Ashford's perfectly coiffed silver hair catching the courtroom's fluorescent lights as she whispered something in Sarah's ear. The worst part wasn't the lies they'd told about me. It wasn't even the way they'd manipulated Emma and Michael, filling their heads with doubts about their father's love and stability. The worst part was how the system seemed designed to believe them. Money talked in family court, and the Ashfords spoke fluent currency. Their attorney had connections, their investigators had resources, and their character witnesses included a city councilman, 2 prominent business owners, and a retired family court judge who just happened to be Donald Ashford's golf partner. My own attorney, Linda Morrison, had done her best with what we had, but court-appointed counsel with an overloaded case schedule couldn't compete with the legal dream team money could buy. We'd presented my military records, my therapy reports showing steady progress, testimonials from my commanding officers about my character and dedication. None of it seemed to matter. The petitioners have demonstrated superior financial resources, Judge Henley had continued, her words hitting me like physical blows. They can provide educational opportunities, extracurricular activities, and a level of stability that, frankly, Mr. Richardson's current circumstances cannot match. Current circumstances. That was judicial speak for the fact that my disability payments and part-time work at a local veterans center couldn't compete with the Ashfords' 7-figure bank accounts. It didn't matter that I'd bled for this country, that I'd carried wounded comrades to safety under enemy fire, that I'd earned decorations most people couldn't even pronounce. What mattered was the bottom line on a financial statement. The courtroom had felt smaller with each passing moment of testimony. Character witnesses for the Ashfords painted them as pillars of their Connecticut community. Charitable donations, volunteer work, memberships in all the right organizations. They'd even brought photos of the children's rooms they'd prepared in their estate, complete with private tutors and writing lessons. My apartment in Tempe, with its 2 small bedrooms and hand-me-down furniture, looked pathetic by comparison. But those walls held memories that no amount of money could buy. Emma's artwork still covered my refrigerator. Michael's baseball trophies lined the living room shelves. This was home, not some mansion where the children would be raised by nannies and sent to boarding school the moment they turned 14. The Ashford strategy had been methodical and ruthless. They'd documented every time I'd been 5 minutes late for pickup, every missed school event due to a therapy appointment, every moment when my service-related injuries had made simple tasks more difficult. They'd taken my greatest sacrifice, my service to this nation, and weaponized it against me. Furthermore, Donald Ashford had testified, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. We have concerns about the violent tendencies Mr. Richardson may have developed during his military service. Children need stability, predictability. They need to feel safe in their own home. Violent tendencies. From a man who'd never served a day in his life, who'd built his fortune foreclosing on struggling families during the housing crisis. From someone who'd never faced an enemy more dangerous than a competitor in a corporate boardroom. The irony would have been laughable if my children's futures weren't hanging in the balance. But the judge had listened, nodded, and made notes. The system that was supposed to protect children's best interests had instead become an auction house where the highest bidder took home the prize. And my children, my Emma with her bright laugh and artistic dreams, my Michael with his boundless energy and love of adventure stories, had become commodities in a transaction I couldn't afford to win. As I sat there watching my ex-wife's family celebrate their victory with barely concealed smiles, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my darkest days in Afghanistan, complete and utter defeat. The enemy this time wore designer suits and spoke in legal jargon, but they'd accomplished what Taliban fighters and roadside bombs had failed to do. They'd broken me. The courtroom began to empty around me, lawyers gathering their files, spectators filing out to resume their normal lives, but my life would never be normal again. Every other weekend, supervised visits with my own children, treated like a stranger in their lives. The Ashfords had won more than custody. They'd stolen my identity as a father, reducing me to a footnote in my children's story. 3 weeks after the custody ruling, I found myself sitting in the parking lot of Sunset Elementary School at 3:15 p.m., watching other parents pick up their children. It had become a ritual of self-torture, this daily reminder of what I'd lost. Emma and Michael would emerge from those familiar red doors, but they wouldn't be looking for me anymore. Instead, they'd climb into the back of Margaret Ashford's pristine Mercedes, their school bags loaded with assignments I'd never see, stories I'd never hear. The supervised visitation had been a disaster from the start. Every other Saturday, I'd drive to a sterile community center on the outskirts of Phoenix, where a court-appointed social worker named Janet Pierce would observe our interactions like we were lab specimens. The woman had the personality of wet concrete and the warmth of an Arctic wind. She'd sit in the corner with her clipboard, scribbling notes every time I raised my voice above a whisper or when Michael got too excited during our card games. "Mr. Richardson, please maintain appropriate boundaries," she'd said during our second visit when I'd attempted to help Emma with her algebra homework. Physical contact should be minimal and purposeful only. Physical contact. I couldn't ruffle my son's hair or give my daughter a hug without this stranger documenting it as potentially concerning behavior. The children felt it too. The artificial atmosphere, the watchful eyes, the underlying message that their father was someone to be feared and monitored. What should have been precious time together became awkward performances under fluorescent lights. Emma had grown quiet during these visits, her usual chatter replaced by careful, measured responses. She'd always been perceptive, my daughter, and she understood that something fundamental had changed. When I'd asked about her art classes, she'd glanced nervously at Janet Pierce before giving me an abbreviated answer about watercolors and perspective techniques. Michael, younger and more volatile, hadn't adapted as well to the new normal. During our third supervised visit, he'd exploded in frustration when Janet had interrupted our reading time to remind us about appropriate voice levels for indoor spaces. "I want to go home with Dad," he'd shouted, his 10-year-old face red with indignation. "Why can't I just go home with Dad like before?" The silence that followed had been deafening. Janet had made another note on her clipboard while Emma had wrapped her arm around her little brother's shoulders, already learning to be the responsible one in impossible situations. I'd wanted to scream, to flip tables, to demand answers from a universe that seemed determined to punish me for serving my country. Instead, I'd knelt down to Michael's level and explained, once again, that sometimes grown-ups had to follow rules that didn't make sense, even when those rules hurt people we loved. The Ashfords had wasted no time implementing their vision for my children's futures. Within a week of gaining custody, they'd enrolled Emma in an exclusive private academy that specialized in preparing students for Ivy League universities. Michael had been placed in a similarly prestigious elementary program, complete with mandatory Latin classes and a uniform that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. They'd also hired a full-time nanny, a stern woman named Victoria Hartwell who'd previously worked for diplomatic families in Washington, D.C. According to the children, Victoria maintained strict schedules, monitored their screen time with military precision, and had already begun implementing what she called cultural enrichment activities: violin lessons for Emma, chess tournaments for Michael, and mandatory French conversation practice during dinner. The house where my children now lived was a monument to wealth and tradition. The Ashfords had purchased a sprawling estate in Paradise Valley, complete with a swimming pool, tennis court, and stables for the horses they'd promised to buy, once the children demonstrated, quote, sufficient responsibility and commitment to their studies. Emma's new bedroom was larger than my entire living room, decorated in shades of cream and gold that reflected Margaret Ashford's taste for understated elegance. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. But it wasn't home. During our supervised visits, Michael would describe his new room with the enthusiasm of someone reciting a grocery list. Emma would mention her private art instructor with polite appreciation, but none of the excitement she'd once shown when explaining her latest sketches. They were being molded into miniature versions of their grandparents, polite, accomplished, and emotionally distant. The psychological evaluations had been the cruelest part of the ongoing legal process. Dr. Amanda Foster, a court-appointed psychologist with credentials that read like an academic achievement catalog, had spent 6 sessions attempting to diagnose my fitness as a parent. Her office smelled like vanilla candles and disappointment, decorated with certificates and awards that proclaimed her expertise in family dynamics and child welfare. "Tell me about your nightmares, Mr. Richardson," she'd said during our second session, her pen poised above a legal pad like a weapon. "How do they affect your daily interactions with Emma and Michael?" I'd tried to explain that my PTSD symptoms were managed, that therapy had given me tools to cope with the occasional flashback or sleepless night, but Dr. Foster seemed more interested in the dramatic aspects of my condition than the reality of my daily life. She'd probed for stories of violence, evidence of unpredictability, anything that might support the Ashfords' narrative of an unstable veteran who posed a danger to his own children. "Have you ever experienced episodes of rage or uncontrolled anger in the presence of your children?" she'd asked, her clinical tone making the question sound both routine and accusatory. The answer was no, but explaining that required context she didn't seem interested in hearing. Yes, I'd struggled with anger after returning from my second deployment. Yes, there had been moments when the transition from war zone to suburban normalcy had felt impossible to navigate. But I'd sought help, done the work, and built a life centered around being the father my children deserved. None of that seemed to matter in her final report, which focused heavily on ongoing concerns regarding emotional regulation and the potential impact of combat-related trauma on parenting capacity. Quote, "Sarah had testified during the custody hearing, but the woman who'd taken the stand bore little resemblance to the person I'd married. Gone was the army wife who'd understood the demands of military life, who'd held our family together during deployments and supported my decision to re-enlist after 9/11. In her place stood someone I barely recognized, perfectly dressed, carefully coached, and willing to sacrifice our shared history for her parents' approval. David became increasingly distant after his return from Afghanistan," she'd told the court, her voice steady but cold. The children were often confused by his behavior, walking on eggshells around him. I tried to be supportive, but there were times when I genuinely feared for our safety. Feared for our safety. The woman who'd slept beside me for over a decade, who'd seen me at my worst and helped me find my way back to the light, had reduced our marriage to a series of calculated lies designed to support her parents' custody grab. She'd mentioned the night terrors, but not how she'd learned to wake me gently. She'd described my hypervigilance in public spaces, but not how it came from a place of wanting to protect our family. She'd painted a picture of an unstable veteran, while conveniently forgetting the man who'd coached Michael's Little League team and never missed one of Emma's school plays. The financial disparity had been perhaps the most demoralizing aspect of the entire process. Every motion the Ashfords filed came with expensive expert witnesses, private investigators, and character references from influential community members. They'd hired specialists in child psychology, military trauma, and family dynamics, an army of professionals whose job was to validate their predetermined conclusions about my unfitness as a father. My own legal representation had been woefully outmatched. Linda Morrison was a competent attorney, but she was fighting with a slingshot against opponents armed with nuclear weapons. We couldn't afford expert witnesses to counter their claims. We couldn't hire investigators to dig into the Ashfords' own complicated history. We were left with basic documentation and the hope that truth and justice might somehow prevail against unlimited resources and institutional bias. The custody modification hearing had been scheduled for 6 months out, giving the Ashfords time to establish what they called stability and routine in the children's lives. What they were really doing was systematically erasing my influence and replacing it with their own vision of proper child-rearing. By the time we returned to court, Emma and Michael would be different children. More polished, perhaps, but strangers to the father who'd raised them for the first 13 and 10 years of their lives. I'd started attending a support group for divorced fathers at the Veterans Center where I worked part-time. The stories were depressingly similar. Men who'd served their country honorably, only to discover that family courts viewed military service as a liability rather than an asset. We'd sit in a circle of folding chairs, sharing our frustrations with a system that seemed designed to punish sacrifice and reward wealth. But none of their stories quite matched mine. None of them were fighting opponents with the resources and connections the Ashfords possessed. None of them faced the particular cruelty of having their service record twisted into evidence of their unworthiness as parents. As I sat in that school parking lot, watching my children disappear into their new life of privilege and supervision, I felt the weight of defeat settling over me like a familiar coat. The gavel had fallen, the papers had been signed, and the system had spoken. All that remained was to figure out how to live with the consequences of loving my country more than I'd protected my family. The custody modification hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October, 6 months after that devastating initial ruling. I'd spent those months working double shifts at the Veterans Center, saving every penny for what I knew would be my last real chance to get my children back. Linda Morrison had warned me that the odds were against us. Modification hearings rarely went in favor of the non-custodial parent, especially when the custodial arrangement appeared to be working smoothly. But I wasn't the same broken man who'd walked out of Judge Henley's courtroom half a year earlier. The support group at the Veterans Center had connected me with other fathers fighting similar battles, and more importantly, with resources I hadn't known existed. A retired Marine colonel named Frank Russo had introduced me to a nonprofit organization that specialized in helping veterans navigate family court challenges. Through them, I'd finally found a real attorney, not court-appointed counsel, but someone who understood both military service and family law. Catherine Walsh was everything. Linda Morrison wasn't. Aggressive, well-connected, and absolutely furious about how the system treated veterans. She'd taken my case pro bono after reviewing the court transcripts, calling the original ruling a travesty that makes a mockery of both justice and military service. For the first time in months, I felt like someone was actually fighting for me, instead of just going through the motions. Catherine had spent the summer building a case that systematically dismantled every argument the Ashfords had made against me. She'd found expert witnesses who could testify about PTSD treatment and recovery, character witnesses from my military service who could speak to my leadership and integrity, and most importantly, she'd hired a private investigator who'd uncovered some interesting details about the Ashfords' own history. Money can buy a lot of things, Catherine had told me during one of our preparation sessions, but it can't erase public records. And your ex-in-laws have some skeletons in their closet that might surprise you. The investigator, a former police detective named Miguel Santos, had discovered that Donald Ashford's business empire wasn't quite as pristine as it appeared. His real estate development company had been involved in several lawsuits over the years: displacement of low-income families, environmental violations, and questionable dealings with city officials. More relevant to our case, there had been complaints filed with Child Protective Services regarding their treatment of household staff's children at their Connecticut estate. The complaints had been dropped after generous donations to various charities, but the paperwork still existed. Margaret Ashford's philanthropic activities also looked different under scrutiny. The family foundation she chaired had a troubling pattern of supporting organizations that aligned with their social circle rather than genuine charitable need. More damaging was the discovery that she'd been arrested for driving under the influence 3 years earlier, an incident that had been quietly handled through expensive legal representation and never made it to the public record. But Catherine's most devastating find was the financial investigation into how the Ashfords were actually treating Emma and Michael. Despite their claims of providing a superior lifestyle, the children were being raised primarily by hired help, while their grandparents maintained their busy social calendar. The nanny, Victoria Hartwell, had been fired after 6 weeks for being, quote, too rigid, according to the employment agency. Her replacement had lasted only 3 months. The children were now on their 4th caregiver in 6 months. The school records told an even more troubling story. Emma's grades had dropped significantly since the custody change, and she'd been referred to the school counselor multiple times for what teachers described as, quote, withdrawn behavior and apparent anxiety. Michael had been involved in several disciplinary incidents, fighting with classmates, defiant behavior with teachers, and what the school psychologist had noted as possible depression symptoms. Neither of these developments had been reported to the court, as required by the custody agreement. The Ashfords had been dealing with these issues privately, hiring tutors and therapists, but never acknowledging that their superior environment might be causing more harm than good. Catherine had also subpoenaed the supervised visitation reports, and Janet Pierce's own documentation supported our case in ways the social worker probably hadn't intended. Her notes consistently described me as patient, engaged, and appropriate in all interactions with the children. She documented the children's obvious distress at the end of each visit, noting that both Emma and Michael regularly asked when they could spend more time with their father. Most importantly, Catherine had arranged for the children to be interviewed by an independent child psychologist, not the court-appointed Dr. Foster who had clear biases, but someone with extensive experience in custody cases and no previous relationship with any of the parties involved. Dr. James Brennan was a respected expert who testified in hundreds of family court cases, and his preliminary report was devastating to the Ashfords' position. Both children had expressed a clear preference for living with their father, despite months of what Dr. Brennan described as subtle but persistent manipulation by their grandparents. Emma had told him that she felt like she was living in a museum where she wasn't allowed to be herself. Michael had been more direct, saying he hated his new school, missed his old friends, and wanted to go home to his dad's apartment where he could actually relax. The Ashfords' legal team had fought hard to suppress Dr. Brennan's report, arguing that the children had been coached and that their statements weren't reliable. But Catherine had anticipated this strategy, and she documented every interaction to prove that no such coaching had occurred. The children's statements were authentic expressions of their genuine feelings about their living situation. As the hearing date approached, I found myself cautiously optimistic for the first time since this nightmare had begun. We had evidence, expert testimony, and most importantly, the children's own voices supporting our case. But I also knew that the Ashfords wouldn't go down without a fight. They'd already filed multiple motions attempting to delay the hearing, challenged our expert witnesses' credentials, and even tried to have Catherine removed from the case for conflicts of interest that didn't actually exist. The night before the hearing, I sat in my small apartment going through the case files one more time. Photos of Emma and Michael covered my coffee table. School pictures, vacation shots, candid moments from the life we'd built together before everything fell apart. Tomorrow would determine whether I'd ever have the chance to build that life again, or whether my children would grow up as strangers, shaped by wealth and privilege but lacking the love and authenticity that had once defined our family. Catherine had warned me that even with our stronger case, we were still fighting an uphill battle. Family courts were reluctant to overturn custody decisions, especially when the current guardians appeared financially stable and respectable. The Ashfords' reputation in the community, their charitable activities, and their apparent devotion to the children's education and extracurricular development would all work in their favor. But I had something the Ashfords couldn't buy or manufacture: genuine love for my children and a service record that proved my commitment to protecting what mattered most. I'd faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, carried wounded soldiers to safety under impossible conditions, and earned decorations that recognized my courage under pressure. Tomorrow morning, I'd find out if any of that meant anything in a system that seemed to value bank account balances over character and sacrifice. The custody modification hearing would begin at 9 a.m. sharp in Judge Patricia Henley's courtroom. The same judge who'd taken my children away would now decide whether I deserved a second chance to be their father. After 6 months of supervised visits, psychological evaluations, and legal maneuvering, everything would come down to a few hours of testimony and argument. I'd worn my dress blues to the original custody hearing, thinking that displaying my military service would demonstrate my character and commitment. This time, Catherine had advised me to wear a simple civilian suit. "Let your service record speak for itself," she'd said. "We don't want to seem like we're grandstanding or playing on emotions. We have facts and evidence on our side now." As I finally turned off the lights and tried to get some sleep, I thought about Emma's last drawing, still stuck to my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like Arizona. It showed our family, her, Michael, me, and even Sarah before everything went wrong, standing in front of our old house with huge smiles on our faces. At the bottom, in her careful handwriting, she'd written, "My family," with a heart dotted over the I. Tomorrow, I'd find out if that drawing would remain a relic of our past, or if it might somehow represent a future we could still build together. The courthouse steps felt different this time. 6 months earlier, I'd climbed them as a desperate man clinging to hope. Now, briefcase in hand and Catherine Walsh beside me, I felt the steady confidence that comes from being properly prepared for battle. The October morning air was crisp, and downtown Phoenix was just beginning to wake up as early commuters hurried past the imposing granite building that would determine my family's future. Catherine had arrived early to review our final strategy. She'd spent the weekend refining her opening statement, anticipating every argument the Ashfords' legal team might present. Marcus Webb would be there, of course, along with 2 additional attorneys they'd brought in specifically for this hearing. Money was no object when it came to keeping custody of my children. "Remember," Catherine told me as we entered the building, "this isn't the same hearing as 6 months ago. We're not asking the court to trust us. We're presenting evidence that demands action. The burden is on them to justify why the current arrangement should continue despite clear evidence of its failure." The security checkpoint was routine, but as we passed through the metal detector, I noticed something different. The courthouse seemed busier than usual for a Tuesday morning, with more federal personnel than I'd seen during previous visits. Several men in dark suits were stationed near the elevators, their earpieces and alert postures marking them as federal agents or marshals. Judge Henley's courtroom looked exactly the same, but the atmosphere was charged with tension. The Ashfords had arrived with their full legal team, taking up most of the plaintiff's section. Donald Ashford wore his usual expression of entitled confidence, while Margaret sat rigid with disapproval. Sarah was notably absent. Catherine had mentioned that she'd filed paperwork removing herself from the proceedings, claiming she wanted to, quote, "remain neutral for the children's sake." Emma and Michael weren't present, of course. The court had ruled that they wouldn't be required to testify, though they would be available for private interviews with Judge Henley if necessary. Knowing they were somewhere in this building, probably in a waiting room with a court advocate, made everything feel more real and urgent. The hearing began with Catherine's opening statement, and I was reminded why she commanded such respect in legal circles. She didn't waste time with emotional appeals or dramatic gestures. Instead, she methodically laid out our case like a prosecutor presenting evidence of a crime. Your Honor, 6 months ago, this court made a decision based on incomplete information and misleading testimony. Today, we will present evidence that the current custody arrangement is not only failing these children, but actively harming them. The petitioners promise stability, superior education, and emotional support. Instead, they have provided a revolving door of caregivers, declining academic performance, and documented psychological distress. She presented Dr. Brennan's psychological evaluation first, walking the court through his findings with clinical precision. Emma's anxiety symptoms, Michael's behavioral problems, both children's expressed desire to live with their father. It was all there in black and white, impossible to dismiss or reinterpret. Marcus Webb objected repeatedly, claiming the evaluation was biased and that the children's statements had been influenced by my supervised visits. But Catherine was ready for every objection, citing legal precedents and professional standards that supported Dr. Brennan's methodology and conclusions. The financial evidence came next, and this was where Catherine's investigation really shone. She presented employment records showing the rapid turnover of nannies and caregivers, school counseling reports that had never been shared with the court, and, most damaging of all, bank records showing that the Ashfords were paying premium rates for, quote, crisis intervention specialists to deal with the children's behavioral issues. The petitioners presented themselves as providing superior care, Catherine argued, but their own financial records tell a different story. They are spending more money trying to manage the problems they've created than Mr. Richardson's entire annual income. These children aren't thriving. They're surviving in an environment that treats them as projects to be managed rather than loved. Donald Ashford's testimony was a masterclass in damage control. He acknowledged the adjustment difficulties, but characterized them as temporary growing pains. The nanny turnover was explained as them having, quote, exceptionally high standards for childcare. The children's academic struggles were dismissed as normal responses to the divorce trauma, not the custody change. But Catherine had done her homework on Donald Ashford himself. During cross-examination, she methodically revealed the gaps between his public persona and private actions. The environmental violations, the questionable business practices, the pattern of using wealth and influence to avoid consequences, it all painted a picture of a man who believed rules didn't apply to him. Mr. Ashford, Catherine asked, you've testified about providing a stable moral environment for Emma and Michael. Are you familiar with the term moral turpitude? Marcus Webb's objection was immediate and sustained, but the damage was done. Catherine had introduced doubt about the Ashfords' character without having to spell out the specific details of Donald's business practices. Margaret Ashford's testimony was more challenging to attack directly. She'd spent decades perfecting the role of the devoted grandmother and community pillar. But Catherine focused on the practical aspects of her involvement with the children, or rather, the lack thereof. Mrs. Ashford, how many hours per week do you personally spend supervising Emma and Michael's homework? Well, we have excellent tutors for that purpose. How many of Emma's art classes have you attended this semester? Victoria handles the transportation to extracurricular activities. When was the last time you prepared a meal for the children yourself? The pattern became clear. Despite their claims of providing hands-on grandparenting, the Ashfords had essentially outsourced child-rearing to a series of paid professionals. The children were living in luxury, but they were also living with strangers. The surprise witness was Janet Pierce, the social worker who'd supervised my visits. Catherine had subpoenaed her over Marcus Webb's strenuous objections, and her testimony was more favorable than anyone had expected. In my professional opinion, Janet testified, Mr. Richardson demonstrated consistent, appropriate parenting behavior during all supervised visits. The children were clearly comfortable with him and showed signs of distress when visits ended. I've supervised hundreds of cases, and this father-child relationship appeared healthy and strong. It was a moment of vindication that felt almost surreal. The same woman who'd scrutinized my every interaction with my children was now testifying on my behalf. her clinical observations supporting what every parent in the courtroom could see, that Emma and Michael belonged with their father. But the Ashfords weren't finished. Marcus Webb had saved his most dramatic argument for last, bringing in a parade of expert witnesses to testify about the benefits of the children's current educational opportunities, their improved financial security, and the potential trauma of another custody change. Dr. Amanda Foster, the psychologist who'd evaluated me initially, returned to testify about the ongoing risks of my PTSD symptoms. She'd clearly been well coached, emphasizing every negative aspect of my condition while minimizing the progress I'd made in treatment. Military-related trauma is a lifelong condition, she testified, and while Mr. Richardson may appear stable now, there's always the risk of regression, especially under stress. The children need consistency and predictability, not the uncertainty that comes with their father's ongoing psychological challenges. Quote, "It was infuriating to sit there and listen to my service to this country being portrayed as a liability, my sacrifice being twisted into evidence of my unfitness as a parent. But Catherine had prepared me for this, and I kept my expression neutral while taking notes for her rebuttal. The hearing had been scheduled for 4 hours, but we were already approaching the lunch break and hadn't even reached my testimony yet. Judge Henley announced a recess, and as the courtroom began to empty, I noticed the federal agents were still present in the hallway. One of them, a tall man with graying temples and a military bearing, seemed to be observing our proceedings with particular interest. Catherine squeezed my shoulder as we gathered our papers. "It's going well," she said quietly. "Better than I expected, but the hardest part is still coming. Are you ready to tell your story?" I looked around the courtroom one more time, thinking about Emma and Michael somewhere in this building, probably wondering why their lives had become so complicated. Then I thought about the medal case in my bedroom closet, the Navy Cross I'd earned in Afghanistan, the symbol of a day when I'd risked everything to save lives and protect freedom. "I'm ready," I told Catherine, and for the first time in months, I truly meant it. After the lunch break, I took the witness stand with the weight of 6 months of frustration and hope pressing down on my shoulders. Catherine had coached me extensively on this moment. Stick to the facts, remain calm, and let my actions speak louder than any emotional appeals. But as I raised my right hand to be sworn in, I caught sight of that federal agent again, now seated in the back row of the courtroom gallery. Something about his intense focus on the proceedings struck me as unusual. Catherine began with my military service, establishing the timeline of my deployments and the circumstances that had led to my tours in Afghanistan. She'd insisted we start here, not because it was directly relevant to custody, but because it provided context for everything that had followed. "Sergeant First Class Richardson," she began, using my military rank, "can you tell the court about your service record?" I kept my answers concise and factual. 2 tours in Afghanistan, serving with the 75th Ranger Regiment, specializing in reconnaissance and direct action missions. I'd been deployed for a total of 32 months over 6 years, always with the understanding that I was serving to protect the freedoms we all took for granted. "During your second deployment, were you involved in any significant combat actions?" This was where things got more difficult. The details of that day in October 2019 were still classified, but Catherine had worked with military legal advisors to determine what I could safely discuss in open court. I described the basics. Our unit had come under heavy fire during a reconnaissance mission, several soldiers had been wounded, and I'd been part of the rescue effort that got everyone home alive. "Were you decorated for your actions during this incident?" "Yes, ma'am. I received the Navy Cross." Marcus Webb's objection was immediate. "Your Honor, the defendant's military service, while admirable, has no bearing on his fitness as a custodial parent. In fact, the trauma associated with these combat experiences supports our position that Mr. Richardson poses an ongoing risk to these children." Judge Henley sustained the objection, but Catherine had made her point. She moved on to my civilian life, my work at the Veterans Center, and my relationship with Emma and Michael before the divorce proceedings began. For 45 minutes, I walked the court through our life together, coaching Michael's baseball team, despite my own physical limitations from service-related injuries, helping Emma with her art projects, even though my hands sometimes shook from old wounds. being present for school events, parent-teacher conferences, and the 1,000 small moments that define a parent-child relationship. Marcus Webb's cross-examination was predictably aggressive. He focused relentlessly on my PTSD symptoms, trying to paint a picture of an unstable veteran whose condition made him unsuitable for unsupervised parenting. He brought up every therapy session, every medication adjustment, every moment of struggle I'd experienced during my transition back to civilian life. Mr. Richardson, isn't it true that you've experienced violent nightmares that have resulted in property damage to your apartment? The question referred to an incident 18 months earlier when a particularly severe nightmare had led to me knocking over a lamp and putting my fist through the bathroom wall. It had happened once. I'd immediately sought additional counseling, and it had never recurred. But in Marcus Webb's hands, it became evidence of ongoing dangerous behavior. Mr. Richardson, have you ever struck another person during one of these episodes? No, sir. But you can't guarantee it won't happen in the future, can you? Catherine's objection saved me from having to answer what was essentially an impossible question. No one could guarantee anything about the future, but Webb was trying to make it seem like I was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode around my children. The questioning continued for over an hour, with Webb systematically attacking every aspect of my character, my stability, and my parenting abilities. He brought up my modest income, my small apartment, my inability to provide the educational opportunities the Ashfords could offer. He made it sound like loving my children wasn't enough if I couldn't also buy them everything money could provide. But something shifted during the final portion of his cross-examination. Webb had been building toward what he clearly thought would be his knockout punch, a detailed exploration of the classified mission that had earned me the Navy Cross. Mr. Richardson, this decoration you mentioned, the Navy Cross, can you tell us exactly what you did to earn it? Catherine's objection was swift. Your Honor, the details of Sergeant Richardson's classified military service are not relevant to this custody determination. On the contrary, Webb argued, if the defendant is going to use his military service as evidence of his character, then the court has a right to examine the nature of that service. What if his actions involve the kind of violence that would make him unsuitable around children? It was a desperate argument, and Judge Henley seemed skeptical. But before she could rule on the objection, something extraordinary happened. The federal agent I'd noticed earlier stood up in the gallery. Your Honor, if I may interrupt these proceedings. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Henley looked startled, and Marcus Webb's mouth literally fell open. It was unprecedented for someone to interrupt a custody hearing, especially a federal law enforcement officer. I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Robert Chen, the man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm here on official business related to this case. Judge Henley recovered her composure quickly. Marshal Chen, this is highly irregular. Are you here to serve papers or make an arrest? Neither, Your Honor. I'm here because Mr. Webb's line of questioning involves classified information that affects national security. The details of Sergeant Richardson's Navy Cross citation remain classified, but I have authorization to share certain information with this court. The marshal walked forward, producing official documents from his briefcase. As he approached the bench, I caught sight of his uniform insignia and felt my heart skip a beat. He was wearing a Navy Cross ribbon on his dress uniform, the same decoration I'd received, though mine was locked away in a case at home. Your Honor, Marshal Chen continued, I served alongside David Richardson during the mission in question. What I can tell you, without compromising operational security, is that this man saved the lives of 7 American soldiers under intense enemy fire. He carried wounded men to safety through 200 yards of open ground while under continuous small arms and RPG fire. His actions that day exemplified the highest traditions of military service and personal courage. The courtroom was dead silent. Marcus Webb looked like he'd been hit by a truck, while Catherine struggled to hide her amazement. Judge Henley studied the marshal's documentation carefully before addressing the court. Marshal Chen, while I appreciate your service and your testimony regarding Mr. Richardson's military record, I'm not sure how this relates to custody determination. Marshal Chen's response was something I would never forget. Your Honor, I've been monitoring these proceedings because the Department of Defense has a vested interest in how our decorated veterans are treated by civilian courts. What I've witnessed here today is a travesty. A man who risked his life for this country being painted as a danger to his own children because of the very service that makes him a hero. He turned to look directly at Marcus Webb. Counselor, you asked what Sergeant Richardson did to earn his Navy Cross. What he did was demonstrate the kind of courage, selflessness, and commitment to protecting others that this country depends on. The suggestion that such service makes him unfit to parent is not only wrong, it's an insult to every man and woman who has worn the uniform in defense of our freedoms. The Marshal's presence had transformed the entire dynamic of the courtroom. Suddenly, this wasn't just a custody dispute between a struggling veteran and wealthy grandparents. It was a referendum on how America treats its heroes. Judge Henley called for a 15-minute recess, but as the courtroom began to clear, Marshal Chen approached our table. Sergeant Richardson, he said, extending his hand, it's an honor to see you again. I've been following your case through veteran advocacy networks. What's happening here isn't justice. It's discrimination, pure and simple. Catherine looked between us, clearly trying to process this unexpected development. Marshal Chen, would you be willing to testify as a character witness? Ma'am, I'm not here in an unofficial capacity. The U.S. Marshal Service has been asked to monitor cases involving discrimination against disabled veterans in family court proceedings. This case has been flagged as a potential example of systematic bias that may require federal intervention. The implications of his words were staggering. This wasn't just about my custody battle anymore. It was about something much larger. As we returned from recess, I realized that everything was about to change, not just for my family, but for how the system treated veterans like me. The afternoon session would be unlike anything Judge Henley had ever experienced in her courtroom. The afternoon session began with an atmosphere unlike anything I'd ever experienced in a courtroom. Marshal Chen had taken a seat at our table, his official presence lending weight to every word Catherine would speak. The Ashfords' legal team huddled in urgent whispered conferences, clearly scrambling to adjust their strategy in the face of federal scrutiny. Judge Henley addressed the Marshal directly before resuming proceedings. Marshal Chen, I want to be clear about your role here. Are you testifying as a witness or observing in an official capacity? Both, Your Honor. The Department of Justice has been tracking cases where military service is being used as evidence against veterans in family court proceedings. This case represents a particularly egregious example of what we believe constitutes discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Veterans' Rights Protection Act. The legal bombshell left Marcus Webb visibly shaken. What had started as a straightforward custody modification hearing was now under federal investigation for civil rights violations. The implications for the Ashfords extended far beyond losing custody. They potentially faced federal charges for discriminatory practices. Catherine seized the moment to call Marshal Chen as her next witness. His testimony was devastating to the opposition's case, not because he attacked the Ashfords directly, but because he provided context that reframed everything that had come before. Marshal Chen, you mentioned you served with Sergeant Richardson. Can you describe his character under extreme stress? David Richardson is the kind of soldier you want beside you when everything goes wrong. During our mission in Afghanistan, when our unit was pinned down by heavy fire and 3 men were critically wounded, he didn't hesitate. He exposed himself to enemy fire repeatedly to reach wounded soldiers and carry them to safety. That's not the behavior of someone who can't be trusted with responsibility. That's the behavior of someone who puts others before himself, even at the cost of his own life. The Marshal's voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed courage firsthand. As he spoke, I noticed something happening in the gallery. Other veterans had begun quietly entering the courtroom, men and women in their dress uniforms, wearing ribbons and decorations that told stories of their own service and sacrifice. In your professional opinion, does Sergeant Richardson's PTSD diagnosis make him unfit for parenting responsibilities? Absolutely not. PTSD is a normal response to abnormal experiences. It's not a character flaw or a sign of weakness. It's evidence that someone has endured trauma in service of their country. With proper treatment, which Sergeant Richardson has consistently pursued, it has no bearing on his ability to be an excellent parent. Marcus Webb's cross-examination of Marshal Chen was a disaster. Every question he asked seemed to dig his clients deeper into a hole of their own making. When he attempted to suggest that the Marshal's testimony was inappropriate federal interference in state court proceedings, Chen's response was swift and decisive. Counselor, when a decorated veteran's military service is being used as evidence against him in a custody proceeding, that becomes a federal civil rights issue. The Department of Justice takes such discrimination very seriously, particularly when it involves systematic bias against disabled veterans. Quote, "The turning point came when Judge Henley called Emma and Michael into her chambers for private interviews. Catherine had requested this option early in the proceedings, but the Ashfords had fought it vigorously. Now, with federal oversight of the case, the judge felt compelled to hear directly from the children about their preferences and experiences. The interviews lasted nearly 2 hours. During that time, the courtroom remained in session, with Marshal Chen providing additional testimony about veteran discrimination patterns in family courts nationwide. What emerged was a troubling picture of systematic bias against service members, particularly those dealing with service-connected disabilities. When Judge Henley returned with the children, her demeanor had changed completely. Emma and Michael weren't required to testify publicly, but their preferences had clearly been communicated to the court. Emma looked relieved for the first time in months, while Michael kept glancing toward our table with barely contained excitement. After speaking extensively with both children, Judge Henley announced, "I have some serious concerns about the current custody arrangement. Both Emma and Michael have expressed clear preferences about their living situation, and their emotional state suggests that the current environment may not be serving their best interests." She turned to address the Ashfords directly. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, while your financial resources and educational opportunities are impressive, parenting involves more than providing material advantages. These children have expressed feelings of isolation, anxiety, and unhappiness that cannot be dismissed simply because they live in luxury." Margaret Ashford's composure finally cracked. "Your Honor, we've given those children everything. The best schools, the finest tutors, opportunities their father could never provide. How can the court ignore those advantages?" "Mrs. Ashford, the court must consider the children's emotional well-being alongside their material circumstances. Your granddaughter told me she feels like she's, quote, living in a hotel where she's not allowed to make noise. Your grandson said he misses feeling like he has a real home. Those are not the words of children who are thriving." The judge's next words would haunt the Ashfords for years to come. "Furthermore, I am deeply troubled by the evidence presented regarding how Mr. Richardson's military service has been characterized in these proceedings. This court will not be a venue for discriminating against veterans who have sacrificed for our country. The suggestion that earning our nation's second highest military decoration somehow makes a man unfit to parent his own children is not only legally problematic, it's morally reprehensible." Catherine stood to present our final argument, but Judge Henley stopped her. "Counselor, that won't be necessary. I've heard enough evidence to make my determination." The moments that followed felt like they lasted hours, though they were probably only seconds. Judge Henley reviewed her notes one final time before delivering her ruling. "The court finds that the current custody arrangement is not in the best interests of Emma and Michael Richardson. Primary custody is hereby awarded to their father, David Richardson, effective immediately. The previous restrictions on Mr. Richardson's parenting time are lifted, and he is granted full legal and physical custody of both children." The sound Emma made, a sob of relief mixed with joy, would stay with me forever. Michael actually cheered, forgetting where he was, until Emma shushed him with a smile brighter than Arizona sunshine. But Judge Henley wasn't finished. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, you are granted supervised visitation rights every other weekend, pending a review in 6 months. Additionally, this court is referring this matter to the federal authorities for investigation into potential civil rights violations. The systematic discrimination against a decorated veteran that I've witnessed in these proceedings may constitute grounds for federal charges." The Ashfords' legal team immediately requested an appeal, but the damage was done. As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave, Marshal Chen approached me one final time. "Sergeant, there's something else you should know. Your case has become a catalyst for broader federal action. The Department of Justice is preparing new guidelines for family courts nationwide regarding the treatment of veteran parents. Your fight might help thousands of other service members facing similar discrimination. 6 months later, Emma and Michael had readjusted to life in our small apartment with remarkable resilience. Emma's grades had returned to their previous levels, and she'd started a new art project, a series of paintings depicting real families that celebrated authenticity over wealth. Michael had rejoined his old Little League team and rarely mentioned the mansion in Paradise Valley where he'd been so unhappy. The Ashfords' supervised visits were awkward affairs, but the children handled them with grace and maturity that exceeded their years. Margaret and Donald seemed diminished somehow, their authority undermined by the federal investigation that ultimately resulted in civil rights violations charges and substantial financial penalties. Sarah had reached out tentatively, seeking to rebuild some kind of relationship with the children. It would take time, but Emma and Michael were willing to try, especially once they understood that their mother had been pressured by her parents into taking positions she didn't truly believe. The veterans who had appeared in that courtroom became part of an extended family network that supported each other through various challenges. Marshal Chen had been promoted partly based on his work exposing veteran discrimination in family courts, and the federal guidelines he'd helped develop were already making a difference in cases across the country. On quiet evenings when homework was finished and the children were reading or drawing in their rooms, I sometimes pulled out the Navy Cross from its case. The medal itself was just metal and ribbon, but what it represented, service, sacrifice, and the willingness to protect others, had ultimately protected my family when we needed it most. The irony wasn't lost on me that the military service the Ashfords had tried to use against me had become the very thing that saved us. In trying to paint my dedication to country as a weakness, they had instead revealed their own fundamental misunderstanding of what truly matters in life. Emma still kept that drawing on our refrigerator, the one showing our family with huge smiles. But she'd added something new to it. A small American flag in the corner, and the words, "My hero dad," written in her careful handwriting. Some battles are fought with weapons in foreign lands, but the most important ones are fought with love, determination, and the belief that truth and justice will ultimately prevail. And sometimes, when you need it most, a federal marshal recognizes your Navy Cross and reminds a courtroom that heroes deserve to be treated like heroes, especially by the children who love them most. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.